Here's the thing about being underestimated. It doesn't hurt the way people think it does. It doesn't land like an insult or a slap. It settles. It finds the lowest part of you and it lives there, quiet, patient, unhurried, for years sometimes, for a whole career maybe, waiting for the one moment when the world runs out of other options and, finally, reluctantly, turns to the person it never thought to ask. Maya Reyes had been waiting for that moment for 6 years. Not for glory. Not for a ceremony where someone with more stars on their collar finally turned to her and said, "We were wrong about you." That's not what she wanted. She would have told you that herself if you'd asked, and she wouldn't have been lying. She was waiting for the moment when the thing she carried, the thing nobody had authorized her to carry, the thing the army had decided she didn't get to keep, turned out to be the only thing standing between the living and the dead. On October 14, 2011, in a dry ravine in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, she got it. An Apache helicopter, losing altitude at 40 meters and dropping wrong. A pilot unconscious over the controls. A dead co-pilot slumped beside him. 3 soldiers bleeding out on the ground behind her, one of them with her hands inside his chest cavity 30 seconds earlier, finishing a procedure while the aircraft came down, because she had calculated the time and he needed 30 more seconds and she gave him 30 seconds. Then, she ran. She climbed into a cockpit she had no business occupying. She touched controls she had no authorization to touch. And, over the next 11 minutes, she did something that nobody in that valley believed was possible until they watched it happen. She brought it down. Not gracefully. Not without cost. Her right wrist fractured on the collective handle during the hard landing, the bone giving way with a sound she described, later, only as expected. She walked away from the aircraft into the dust and the noise and went immediately back to her patients without telling anyone what she'd done to her wrist for another 4 hours, because there were more pressing things to do and she was a medic and pressing things were her entire job description. I was the JAG officer sent to determine whether what she did should end her career. My name is Captain Daniel Osei. I have spent 17 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps documenting the edges of what people do under pressure, the decisions that fall outside the lines, the actions that the regulations were never written to cover because nobody imagined them happening. I have interviewed soldiers in hospitals and interrogation rooms and aid stations and the backs of trucks. I have read thousands of incident reports. I have never read 6 words that worked as hard as these: Sergeant Reyes was present. 6 words in a paragraph about a helicopter that should have killed its pilot. 6 words written by a man who knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote them. What I found when I arrived at FOB Kamdesh was not the story in the incident report. The incident report was a door left deliberately ajar. What was behind it was something the Army's paperwork had no form for, no checkbox, no field to populate. It was a woman who had been carrying a dead man's dream for 6 years and had finally, in 11 minutes over an Afghan ravine, set it down. Not for an audience. Not for a record. For the 3 men bleeding out on the ground behind her. For the pilot whose breathing she monitored with one hand while she flew with the other. For the math she had run in the time it took her to cross 40 meters of open ground: who dies if I don't, and who dies if I do it wrong, and what is the acceptable exchange? She had done the math before. She had been doing it since she was 22 years old and her little brother didn't come home from a training flight and she had sat in a JAG office not entirely unlike the one I occupied and identified his personal effects. She had done the math and she had climbed in. This is what I found when I went looking. This is the story that the passive voice was trying to protect. Part 1, The Shape of What Wasn't Said. Part 2, 11 minutes. Part 3, The Weight of the Word Present. I read the incident report 3 times on a cot in Jalalabad the night before I flew forward. First pass, facts. Second pass, contradictions. Third pass, the third time I read it the way my mother used to read letters from my father when he worked the oil fields and was months away, the same paragraph over and over, not hunting for information but for the thing the information was covering. The way you listen to a sentence said too carefully by someone who loves you. CW3 Marcus Webb's preliminary statement. 6 pages of precise, sequential documentation of a close air support mission gone bad. Fire, altitude loss, crew incapacitation, emergency descent. 6 pages. Then, the aircraft regained stability. I was unable to determine the mechanism of recovery due to incapacitation. When I regained consciousness, we were on the ground. I sustained a concussion and 2 cracked ribs. The aircraft was down but intact. Sergeant Reyes was present. Sergeant Reyes was present. Not Sergeant Reyes recovered the aircraft. Not Sergeant Reyes performed an emergency landing. Not I do not know how the aircraft was stabilized. Webb was a warrant officer with 12 years of flight experience and a concussion, not amnesia. He had chosen his words the way you choose which bridge to burn and which to keep. Sergeant Reyes was present the way a river is present when a man is drowning. The way the one solid thing in a collapsing room is present. Attribution attached to nothing. Verb doing no work at all. A sentence that said she was there and spent every other syllable not saying what she was doing there, and anyone who read it carefully enough would understand they were meant to ask. I turned off my flashlight and lay back and listened to Jalalabad airfield at night, the rotors in the distance, the generator hum, the dry wind pushing something metallic across gravel somewhere to my right. I have a particular relationship with silence. My father was a man of very few words and enormous presence, and growing up in his house I learned to hear the space between what someone says and what they mean. It's not a skill they teach in law school. It should be. I got up and packed my kit. 11 months across 3 rotations in country and I had learned to pack in 4 minutes in the dark. 7 items. Moleskine. 2 pens. The small carved Sankofa symbol on my key ring, rosewood, worn smooth. My grandmother pressed it into my hand the morning I left Ghana at 12 years old and I had carried it every day since, in a superstition I'd never tried to examine too closely. Change of socks. My copy of the UCMJ, which I'd read so many times I didn't need it but carried anyway, the way athletes carry the same water bottle. I opened the Moleskine. At the top of a fresh page I wrote, Maya Reyes, Staff Sergeant, 68W. Then, I wrote, Sergeant Reyes was present. Then, I drew a line under it and looked at the space below. 6 days to conduct the preliminary inquiry. My recommendation would determine whether she faced a formal charge under Article 109, willful destruction, damage, or improper hazarding of military property, or whether this matter was administratively resolved and quietly filed. My job was fact-finding. I was a camera, not a judge. I already knew I was lying to myself. The Black Hawk from Jalalabad to FOB Kamdesh took 40 minutes and smelled like hydraulic fluid and someone's unfinished lunch and the particular mineral anxiety of an aircraft that carried nervous people for a living. I sat by the porthole with Maya Reyes's service record in my lap and the rotor noise heavy enough to think inside. 28 years old. Laredo, Texas. Father, deceased, 2003, cardiac event. Mother, Maria Reyes, Laredo. One sibling, the record listed a brother, then a slash, then a date that I registered but didn't yet understand, and then see NOK notification 2005. I circled it and moved on. Enlisted at 19. Basic at Fort Benning, AIT at Fort Sam Houston. Combat medic. 2 Iraq rotations. 1 prior Afghan rotation, 2009 to 2010, Kunar Province. Combat Action Badge awarded November 2010 following direct contact in which she maintained her aid station and treated 11 casualties under indirect fire. 11. In 3 hours. While her aid station took 2 rounds that didn't detonate. The evaluations were what held me. 5 different raters over 9 years. 5 different command structures. Different theaters, different units, different standards of what good looked like. And every single one had found some version of the same phrase, performs beyond scope of MOS. 1. A battalion surgeon named Carver, who'd written her 2010 evaluation, had put it more specifically, Sergeant Reyes operates with a situational awareness that exceeds her training parameters. This is not a performance deficiency. It is a structural limitation of the 68W classification. Recommend consideration for advanced coursework. Nobody had acted on Carver's recommendation. I closed the file and looked at the Hindu Kush through the porthole. Below us the valley was pale brown and enormous, the Cunner River threading through it like a suture through a wound that had been trying to close for 1,000 years. I had spent 11 months in this country and still couldn't make it familiar. Not dangerous unfamiliar. Not hostile unfamiliar. It was the disorientation of a place described to me in a language I half spoke, like knowing enough Pashto to understand water and stop and I am not your enemy, but not enough to know if what was coming back at you was agreement or something else entirely. The Black Hawk banked left. The valley tilted. I pressed my Sankofa key into my palm and thought, return and get it. Go back for what was lost. Major Eric Harkins met me at the LZ with his closing argument already prepared. He was 6'2" and the kind of officer who'd grown into his rank the way some men grow into their father's suits, not earned exactly, just gradual, until the fit stopped looking borrowed. His handshake was one firm pump, forensically calibrated. He told me he was glad Jag had sent someone level-headed. I thanked him and said nothing about what I thought he meant. He walked me toward the TOC through dust that tasted of old fires and something mineral I never managed to identify. The FOB had the particular organized scrappiness of a post that had been extended past its planned lifespan, fortifications repaired but asymmetrical, roads through the camp worn into ruts that would outlast any resurfacing. Everything functional. Nothing quite right. Sergeant Reyes is an excellent soldier, Harkins said. He held a door for me. The interior of the TOC was cool and smelled of coffee and recycled electronics. I've read her file, I said. Good. Then, you know. He gestured toward a folding chair and took the one behind the desk. This is a complex situation. What she did, what appears to have happened, it's outside any established framework. We want it handled correctly. He used the word correctly the way people use the word appropriately, as a box they're trying to get you inside. I sat down and placed my moleskine on my knee and looked at him with the expression I'd spent 17 years calibrating, attentive, neutral, the face of a man who has not yet formed an opinion. Walk me through the immediate response, I said. My XO was first on scene post-incident. Reyes was with the aircraft when they reached her. She'd already begun treating Webb for his head injury. He was conscious by then, she'd collared him, she was monitoring him. The aircraft was essentially intact. Tail rotor damage, some frame stress, but the airframe wasn't destroyed. He shifted. It was a hard landing. That's all the physical evidence tells us. A controlled hard landing in the flat area near the aid post. And the witnesses put her in the cockpit prior to landing. Silence. Several witnesses report seeing her near the aircraft, he said carefully. In the cockpit, I repeated. He looked at his desk. Captain, what I want to communicate is that we have a situation with multiple possible interpretations, and we have an exceptional soldier whose record speaks for itself, and we have an outcome in which everyone who could have died did not die. He folded his hands. I'm asking for perspective. I looked at him for a moment. Major, I said, I appreciate the context. I'm going to do my interviews now. Specialist Aaron Danner was 23 years old and from a small town in southeastern Ohio whose name I wrote down and immediately forgot. He had the careful, slightly stunned quality of someone who'd been good at everything before the Army and had discovered in the Army that goodness of that kind meant very little unless it was the right kind of goodness for the moment you were in. He touched his left ear when he was uncertain. I noticed it within the first 2 minutes and watched for it after that. Tell me what you saw, starting from when Reaper 6 was first in distress. He looked at the far wall for a moment, organizing. The bird had been working a ridgeline above us. We were at the LZ, the designated extraction point, about 200 meters from the main contact. He touched his ear. Reaper 6 came back for overwatch while we were staging the casualties. And then, it started going wrong. Describe going wrong. A helicopter going down right looks like a controlled thing. Like it's deciding where to be. He frowned. This one was fighting. The nose kept dropping, the tail kept swinging left. It was losing altitude but not in a controlled way. More like, he thought about it. Like two pilots with opposite ideas. No functioning pilot. We didn't know that yet. We knew it was wrong. He shifted. The bird was maybe 50 meters above the ravine floor at that point. 40 meters from our position. If it came down the way it was trending, it would have come down on you. On the LZ. On the casualties. Yes, sir. And Sergeant Reyes was where at this point? He touched his ear. She was treating Vasquez, he said. PFC Vasquez. Chest wound, probable hemopneumothorax. She was doing a needle decompression. It's a procedure where you insert a needle into the chest cavity to relieve pressure on the lung. He said it the way someone explains something they need to explain correctly because the details matter to the story's truth. She was mid-procedure. Both hands occupied. The bird started going wrong and she looked up. She stopped. She looked up. And then, she didn't stop. His voice shifted slightly into something that was still processing the event even as he described it. She finished the procedure. Vasquez needed another 30 seconds and she gave him 30 seconds while the helicopter was coming down. 30 seconds, sir. I counted. He paused. Then, she told me to apply pressure and stay down and she ran. She finished the procedure. I wrote it in my moleskine and underlined it. 2 words doing architectural work. What did running look like? Just running. Toward the aircraft. Straight at it. Did she say anything? No. He paused. Maybe. I couldn't hear. And, when she reached the aircraft? She climbed in. He said it plainly. The plainness of someone for whom the act has not become less extraordinary with repetition, only more condensed. The cockpit. She climbed into the cockpit. From the ground? She got up on the skid. Then, into the gunner's seat, the co-pilot seat. He stopped. Touched his ear. Torres wasn't an obstacle. I let that sit. How long until the aircraft stabilized? Maybe 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes. The nose stopped trying to drop. The tail stopped swinging. It was still losing altitude, but it was losing it right, if that makes sense. Controlled. And then, it came down hard on the flat ground about 15 meters from the aid post. And Reyes? She came out of the cockpit. She didn't look at us. She went straight back to Vasquez and checked my pressure application and adjusted it, and then she checked on the other casualties. He paused. She had blood on her jacket from before, from the procedure. She had dust all over her from the landing. She didn't say anything about it. I looked at him. Has she talked about it since? He shook his head. Not once. Not to anyone? She asked me, that night, if Vasquez was stable. He looked at his hands. That was it. That was everything she said about any of it. I closed my moleskine. One more thing. When she looked up at the helicopter before she ran. You said she looked like she'd remembered something she'd been trying to forget. He nodded slowly. What did that look like? He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that's doing real work. Like recognition, he said finally. Like she'd met it before. Sergeant First Class Luis Pollard had 17 years in the Army and the face of a man who had been quietly and thoroughly unimpressed by most of them. He was 41 and chewed a toothpick throughout our conversation with the focused energy of someone who needed their hands occupied to let their mind run free. He addressed me as Captain Rank, not name, with a precision that was not quite respect and not quite its opposite. You want the facts, he said. I want your account. My account is the facts. He moved the toothpick. I've been in combat with 130-some people over 17 years, Captain. You want to know what I know about Reyes? Everything you'll tell me. She never does anything extra. He said it like a compliment that had chosen not to announce itself as one. No grandstanding. No, he waved a hand. No heroic noise.
She does exactly what needs doing and, not one molecule more, and, she does it right the first time, and, then, she does the next thing.
You've worked with her for how long? This rotation. 7 months. He paused. Long enough?
He turned the toothpick between his fingers and stared somewhere past me at something private. I watched her, November of last year, before this rotation, I watched her talk down a 19-year-old kid who'd just watched his best friend get blown apart. She held his face in her hands and talked to him for 4 minutes in the middle of active indirect fire. He put the toothpick back. She didn't do it because she wasn't scared. She did it because she'd already calculated that if she didn't, he was going to walk into the wire.
He looked at me. That's not bravery. That's math. Her math. Tell me about the incident.
He was quiet for a moment. I watched her climb into that cockpit, he said slowly, and carefully, like laying bricks in sequence.
And, I thought, okay. The way you think okay when something happens that you don't have another word for.
And, then, the bird steadied.
And, I thought, wait.
And, then, it came down hard, but right. And, I thought, he took the toothpick out entirely, held it.
I thought, who the hell is she? You didn't know she had any flight experience. Nobody knew. He set the toothpick on the table. And, I'd have bet money. I pay attention to people I work with. I read them. It's not a thing I decide to do, he rubbed the side of his jaw. I pay attention. 7 months with Reyes, I would have told you everything she was. I would have been confident. He picked the toothpick back up. I was wrong. The aid station at 1600 hours smelled of antiseptic and dust and something sweet I couldn't identify, a protein bar, maybe, or something left behind in the walls by years of wounded people passing through, some residue of urgency metabolized into the fabric of the room. She was rewrapping a ranger's thumb. Her back was to the door. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the task was automatic enough to think through but not automatic enough to insult the professional middle register, attention present without performance. The ranger sat on the treatment cot and held very still with the expression of a large man trying to take up as little space as possible. I stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Shorter than I'd imagined, 5'4", maybe 5'3". Black hair pulled severely back. A scar running from the corner of her left eyebrow toward her temple, old, white-silver, the kind of scar that has long since stopped being a story and become just a feature. She wore her sleeves down in a FOB where everyone else had rolled theirs up in the October heat. Her hands moved. I watched her hands, specifically watched the economy of them, the way they didn't waste motion or force, the way they communicated information to themselves via the task faster than conscious thought could manage it. The hands of someone who had spent so many hours working on human bodies in extremis that the hands had developed their own intelligence, their own memory. She knew I was there. I could tell because nothing in her tempo changed, and the deliberateness of that stillness was itself a response. Sergeant Reyes. Captain. Still not looking up. Give me 90 seconds. I gave her 90 seconds. The thumb was wrapped. The ranger was given concise discharge instructions in a voice that functioned simultaneously as clinical guidance and a polite removal from the room. He left. He did not look at me. She stood. Stripped her gloves, left-handed, I noticed, despite the fact that her right was the dominant, and turned to face me. Brown eyes. Doing a great deal of work to look like they were doing nothing. I know why you're here, she said. Why is that? You're JAG. You're here because I got in a helicopter that wasn't mine and you're trying to find the article that fits. She moved to the supply cabinet and began inventorying with her back to me, lifting small bottles, reading labels with an attention that was technically about the labels. My statement says what I did. Your statement says you entered the aircraft to attend to the injured pilot. Yes. Which is consistent with your MOS. But, the aircraft then, performed a controlled emergency landing instead of the uncontrolled descent that multiple witnesses described prior to your entry.
She turned a bottle in her right hand.
Turned it back. Webb must have regained consciousness, she said. CW3 Webb has a grade 3 concussion.
He has no memory of anything from the point of incapacitation until he was on the ground with you applying a cervical collar. She examined the bottle. Then, I got lucky, she said. The room held itself very still. Somewhere outside, someone was working on something mechanical, a rhythmic metallic tapping, patient, purposeless sounding, the kind of background sound that makes silence more solid.
I looked at her hands. The right one holding the bottle.
The left at her side, slightly curled, not quite a fist. When she'd stripped her gloves she'd done it left-handed even though she rapped with her right. And, the grip on the bottle was fractionally tighter than the weight of the bottle required.
I thought about the wrist.
Hairline fracture, right distal radius, the medical report had noted sustained at some point during the incident, time frame unspecified, as she had not reported it for 4 hours. She had declined pain medication. I thought about a cyclic control handle. I thought about the forces transmitted through a pilot's wrist during a controlled emergency landing at high descent rate. I thought about what it costs to grip something all the way down and not let go. Sergeant Reyes, I said.
She turned around. Set down the bottle.
Looked at me with a gaze that had been prepared for this moment, maybe since she'd walked off that aircraft, maybe since before that, maybe from a much older and more private place. Looked at me and let me see, for just a fraction of a second, the shape of what was underneath the maintenance.
What time do you want me? She said. Not a question. The end of a round. 0800, I said. She nodded. Turned back.
I walked to the door and stopped, and I don't know why I stopped except that the room had a feeling of unfinished weight, like a sentence that had paused in the middle of something that mattered.
How is he? I said.
Vasquez.
Her hands went still. A beat smaller than a breath. He's in Landstuhl, she said. He'll keep the lung. Good, I said. I meant it as good for Vasquez.
But, I think some part of me also meant it for her, for the 30 seconds she'd given him while the helicopter came down, for the arithmetic of her math, for the thing she'd been carrying that had, in the space of 11 minutes, finally, been allowed to be useful.
She didn't respond. I walked out. I sat outside the TOC that night on an ammo crate and ate a cold MRE and looked at the Hindu Kush in the dark. The mountains were shapes made of absence, darker than the sky, which at this altitude and this hour was luminous with a density of stars I never stopped finding disorienting, like being under something instead of above it. My father used to say, the thing about carrying something for a long time is that eventually you forget you're carrying it. You think it's just you. You think it's your own weight. I had met people like that. People whose burden had been integrated so completely that they could no longer feel its edges, only its effects, the angle they held their shoulders, the economy of their movements, the way their eyes settled on exits before they settled on anything else. The weight was invisible because they had made themselves into the weight's shape. But, in crisis, in the specific, irreducible crisis of a helicopter coming down on the people they were responsible for keeping alive, the shape became legible. I opened my Moleskine. I thought about Danner. She looked like she'd remembered something she'd been trying to forget. I wrote 3 questions for the morning. Crossed out 11. What remained? How did you know what to do? Have you done it before? And, the third one, which I'd almost removed because it fell outside every professional framework I operated in, which had nothing to do with Article 109 and everything to do with the specific kind of person who grips a cyclic with a breaking wrist and doesn't let go. What were you thinking about when you brought it down? I capped my pen. The stars were unreasonably present. Above me, in the cold, they made no concession to the scale of anything happening below them. I thought about 6 words. Sergeant Reyes was present. Webb had written those words knowing exactly what they were doing. He had given her the passive voice the way you give someone the only thing you have that might help, not enough, possibly, but something. A grammatical shelter. She was here, but I am not saying she was here in any way that requires you to do anything about it. My job, arriving tomorrow morning at 0800, was to take the shelter away. I sat with that for a long time. The wind came up. Something metallic moved in the dark. I put the MRE down and went inside. She was already in the room when I arrived. 07:58. I knew because I had checked my watch twice, once at the TOC door, once outside the interview room, with the specific anxiety of someone who suspects the first check might have been wrong. The small white room smelled of plywood and the ghost of previous cigarettes and the institutional coffee she had apparently acquired from somewhere, because there were 2 cups on the table when I opened the door, and she was sitting with her hands around one of them and looking at the wall with the focused nothing of someone doing arithmetic they don't want witnessed. She looked at me when I came in. "I didn't know how you took it," she said, gesturing at the second cup. "It's black." "Black is fine." I sat across from her. Set my Moleskine on the table and my pen beside it. The table was folding metal, 4 feet wide, the kind that could be stored and forgotten. Between us, 2 cups of coffee, 3 questions, and whatever she'd decided overnight about how much of the truth she was going to let me have. I went through the formal caution. Article 31. The right to remain silent, the right to consult counsel, the right to have counsel present. I had printed the form and I read it with the care I gave it every time, which was complete care, because the form was protection for her and I took that seriously, even especially in situations where she might not want it. She listened. At the end I asked if she understood her rights. "Yes, sir." "Do you wish to have counsel present?" She looked at the second cup of coffee, the one I hadn't touched yet. "No." She said it like she'd considered it and concluded that counsel would make her too careful, and careful wasn't what she'd come here for. I signed the form. She signed it with her left hand, I noticed, holding it flat with the right, the fractured wrist in its thin wrap, holding paper weight. I set the form aside. Outside, somewhere, a helicopter passed, not one of ours. The pitch was different, higher, a scout bird working a ridge. We both heard it. She tracked it with her eyes toward the ceiling without moving her head, and then it passed and her eyes came back and she looked at me. "Ask," she said. "How did you know what to do?" The question sat on the table between us. She looked at it for a long time. "The cyclic and the collective," she said finally. "The cyclic controls the direction of the rotor disc, it's the stick between your knees, essentially. The collective is the lever on your left, it controls the pitch of all the rotor blades simultaneously, which controls altitude." She said it with the texture of recitation, of something repeated enough times internally to have worn a groove. When I got into the cockpit, the cyclic was angled forward and left because Webb was slumped against it. The collective was neutral. The bird was in autorotation, which means it was descending under rotor inertia rather than engine power, but the autorotation was uncontrolled because the disc angle was wrong. She took a sip of coffee. I moved the cyclic to neutral and the disc angle corrected. That stopped the nose from dropping. Then, it was just managing the descent. She set the cup down, threading it into the flat area near the aid post instead of into the ravine. I wrote. "When you say managing the descent," I said, "what does that involve, mechanically?" "Anti-torque pedals for heading control. Cyclic for lateral drift. Collective for rate of descent." She looked at the table. Watching the rate of descent indicator. Listening to the rotor pitch. Feeling it through the controls. A helicopter communicates a lot through the controls if you know how to listen to it. "If you know how to listen to it," I said. Pause. "Yes." I looked at her. She looked at the wall behind me, and I understood that she was fully aware of what she had just said and was making no move to retrieve it. "Second question," I said. "Have you done this before?" "Not in combat." She said it immediately, without touching her ear or looking away, which meant it was exactly as true as it sounded and also exactly as incomplete. I waited. She held the pause the way someone holds a breath before a cold plunge. "I had time in simulators," she said. "A long time ago." "What kind of simulators?" "Rotary. AH-64, A-60. Another pause. "Fort Rucker." I wrote it down. "Fort Rucker, Alabama."
The Army's Aviation Training Center.
The place you went when you were learning to fly. How much time? Enough.
She looked at her coffee.
Not enough to be a pilot. Enough to know where everything was. Enough to understand the language. She looked up at me.
I hadn't sat in a real cockpit since 2005.
6 years before this conversation. I filed the number and didn't pull on it yet. Walk me through the 11 minutes, I said.
She set her cup down and folded her hands and looked somewhere slightly to the left of my shoulder, the focused inward gaze of someone accessing a file they keep in a specific place, a specific part of their mind, a drawer they open carefully and close completely every time. I heard the bird change pitch about 30 seconds before Danner did, she said.
The rotors.
The tone changes when the disc angle shifts. I was mid-procedure with Vasquez, so I noted it and kept working. She looked at her hands briefly.
I gave him 30 seconds because he needed 30 seconds.
Then, I told Danner what to do and I ran.
What were you thinking while you ran? A beat. The smallest I'd measured. I was calculating the LZ geometry, she said.
The ravine floor was sloped to the east. If the bird came down in the ravine, it would roll, possibly ignite. Webb might survive the initial landing, but not a fuel fire in an enclosed space. The flat area near the aid post was the only viable landing site, but it was occupied, the casualties were there, and Danner, and 2 other soldiers.
She paused.
If I could get in and correct the disc angle, I could aim for the flat area. If I couldn't, the bird was going to come down in the ravine and roll east toward the medevac site anyway.
So either way, it was going to come close to the medevac site.
Either way, she agreed. The question was whether it arrived there as a controlled hard landing or a burning rotor disc crash.
You calculated all of that while running?
Yes, sir.
I believed her. Implicitly. The way I had believed Pollard when he said she doesn't do anything extra. The math was her language. The math was what she ran on. You climbed into the cockpit. Describe Torres. Her jaw tightened once. Loosened.
He was gone, she said. The RPG proximity blast.
He was gone.
I confirmed it in about 2 seconds and turned to Webb.
And, Webb? Unconscious.
Respiration present, 8 per minute, slow but present. Pupils, I couldn't assess pupils without a light, but the rest of his presentation was consistent with concussion and shock.
He was alive.
She looked at me directly.
He was going to stay alive.
There was something in the way she said it, not a prediction, not a hope. A decision made retroactively.
He was going to stay alive.
Past tense about a future she had decided on unilaterally.
Describe the first 30 seconds in the cockpit.
She closed her eyes for a moment.
Opened them. The cyclic was angled. I moved it.
The nose corrected, not completely, it was still oscillating, but the worst of the drop stopped. The bird was still in auto-rotation, still descending, maybe 80 feet above the ravine floor. She said it like reading coordinates. I took the collective and raised it slightly, not too much. You don't want to bleed rotor RPM if you're in auto-rotation, you're managing the stored inertia, you use it in controlled doses.
She paused. The descent rate slowed. What were the instruments telling you? Altitude, rate of descent, rotor RPM. She ticked them off.
The engine was still producing, it was a hydraulics issue, not an engine failure, so I had power, I just needed to redirect it. The altimeter was reading low because the ravine floor elevation was above sea level and I had to estimate actual height above ground from what I could see through the chin bubble.
You had to estimate. I had to estimate. I had no radar altimeter reading, either it wasn't working or I didn't have time to find it. She met my eyes. I estimated from the rocks. I sat back. How? The size of the rocks, she said, and it wasn't apologetic, it wasn't a concession, it was just a fact, offered with the same matter-of-factness as everything else. When rocks stop looking like specks and start looking like boulders, you're under 100 feet.
When they stop looking like boulders and start looking like individual stones, you're under 50. When you can see the shadows on the faces of individual stones, she paused.
You're very close. Silence.
I looked for the flat area, she said. I could see it through the chin bubble, the casualty collection point. I could see Danner on the ground with his hand on Vasquez. I could see the other soldiers prone on the ground. I told them to go prone through the window. I'd knocked on the glass and pointed down, and they understood.
You knocked on the. I stopped. Let it go.
I could land in the flat area, but I had to clear the ridge on the north end of it. If I came in slow and high, I'd make the clearing, but I'd have insufficient landing energy and the bird would drop at that weight, from even 20 feet, that's uncontrolled. I needed to come in fast enough to have control, which meant I was going to hit hard.
How hard?
She looked at her wrist. About that hard, she said.
I understood that we were done with the physical mechanics. I gave her a moment.
She used it to drink her coffee, which was surely cold by now, and to look at the wall with the expression of someone closing a drawer.
Third question, I said. She looked at me. What were you thinking about when you brought it down? The longest pause yet.
It lived in the room with us for what felt like a full minute but was probably 8 seconds.
I didn't move. I didn't write.
I looked at her and she looked at something I couldn't see, and the scout helicopter passed again outside, or a different one, working the same ridge, and neither of us tracked it this time.
The guy's on the ground, she said. What else?
Her eyes came back to me.
Slightly narrowed. She hadn't expected a what else.
I was talking, she said.
I didn't realize I was doing it until I was already doing it. Out loud.
She looked at the table. I don't know that it was coherent.
Who were you talking to?
The drawer. She opened it, held it, looked at what was inside, and then, she said one word in a voice that had been stripped of everything except the word itself, Diego.
She didn't elaborate. I did not ask.
The word sat in the room the way a weight sits in water, not floating, not sinking, just finding its depth, and the depth it found was not mine to measure.
I looked at my moleskine. I had written nothing for the last 4 minutes. I wrote nothing now either.
I wrote the absence of writing. I drew a line and held my pen above it.
Captain. I looked up. What are you going to recommend? She said. I looked at her for a long moment. I don't know yet, I said.
She looked at me with the evaluating steadiness of someone deciding whether an answer is honest or diplomatic. She apparently concluded it was both, which seemed to satisfy something she'd needed to confirm.
Fair enough, she said.
She put both palms flat on the table and stood. Gathered her coffee cup, the empty one. Picked up a folder she'd brought that she'd never opened. The 3 soldiers who were at the LZ, she said, at the door.
Not turning around. Vasquez is in Landstuhl. Bowen and Kraft, she paused. They went home last week. Bowen's going to have a limp. Kraft is going to have a jaw that sets wrong. A beat. They're going home, though. I said nothing. She left.
I sat in the empty room for a long time. The fluorescent light above me hummed at a frequency that I would have found irritating in any other context and now barely noticed. I looked at the table, 2 empty coffee cups, my moleskine open to a page with 4 lines of writing and then a line and then nothing. Outside, the mechanically patient sound of a FOB continuing to function.
Someone yelling a name. A vehicle starting.
The rotors of the scout bird, fading, returning, fading again. I thought about the physics of what she'd done.
An AH-64D Apache weighs approximately 10,400 pounds empty. Combat loaded, you add armament, fuel, crew.
Add the chaos coefficient, 1 crew dead, 1 incapacitated, a descent begun before the pilot who would manage it had any chance to prepare for it. Add the geography, a ravine with a usable landing area the size of a tennis court, bordered on one end by a rock shelf and, on the other by soldiers flat on the ground. Add 1 person with no current flight certification, no flight status, a wrist that fractured under the forces of what she was doing, 6 years away from the last time she had sat in any cockpit.
Add the math.
Her math, running the way Pollard had described it, not heroic, not suicidal, simply relentless, the unstoppable arithmetic of a person who could not stop calculating the difference between who lives and who doesn't.
I thought about the name she'd said. Diego.
I thought about the way she'd said it, not grief exactly.
Not memory. Something more specific.
The name of someone she spoke to regularly, privately, in the machinery of her own inner life. The name of someone who was part of how she understood what she was doing when she was doing it.
A long time ago. Fort Rucker. The sibling notation in her service record. The slash. The date. The CNOK notification 2005. I should have looked it up the night before. I had been tired and had told myself I would deal with the gaps in the morning. I was lying to myself again, and I was getting tired of catching myself at it. I opened my laptop. Fort Rucker, 2005.
I found the training accident in the JAG database. The Army keeps meticulous records of its accidents, which is one of its more useful habits and one of its more brutal ones. You can read the mechanical cause of a man's death in a database entry written in the same tone used to record routine maintenance. Black Hawk, training flight, October 14, 2005.
3 crew.
Instructor pilot and 2 student pilots.
Instrument failure cascade. Controlled flight into terrain.
The instructor and 1 student pilot survived with injuries. 1 student pilot was killed on impact. Private First Class Diego Reyes, 20 years old, Laredo, Texas.
I sat with that for a while. Then, I looked for the other name. Student Reyes, M.A.
Enrolled in the 15A Warrant Officer Candidate Course, Fort Rucker.
Disenrollment date, October 19, 2005. 5 days after the accident.
Reason, medical disqualification, acute adjustment disorder with anxious features, as diagnosed by the Fort Rucker mental health officer following a flight evaluation in which the student demonstrated acute anxiety response and was unable to complete a simulated engine failure and auto-rotation procedure. A simulated engine failure.
An auto-rotation. I looked at the date. October 14, 2005.
The date of Diego's accident.
October 14, 2011. The date of the incident at FOB Kamdesh.
I sat in the empty interview room for a long time with my laptop open and the fluorescent light humming and the Moleskine in my hands and the specific weight of understanding something that you cannot ununderstand.
She hadn't planned it.
The date was not a decision, it was a collision. The calendar didn't arrange itself for her. She had simply been in a ravine in Kinner province on a specific October day doing what she always did, finishing the procedure, doing the math, staying with whoever needed staying with, and the sky had given her the one thing she had been unable to do 6 years earlier in a simulator at Fort Rucker.
The one thing they had said she couldn't do. The auto-rotation.
She had done it with a broken wrist in a combat zone with dead weight on the controls and people on the ground below her who could not afford for her to fail. She had done it the only way she ever did anything, without extra, without noise, without ceremony.
I looked at my 3 questions. How did you know what to do?
She knew because she had been learning since she was 22 years old and her brother had died doing what they had both been trying to learn and she had carried the unfinished knowledge like a debt she couldn't close.
Have you done it before? Not in combat.
Not in 6 years. Not since the simulator test she couldn't finish the week Diego was buried.
What were you thinking about when you brought it down?
I looked at the empty chair where she'd been sitting. I thought about a 22-year-old girl at Fort Rucker in October 2005, in a simulator that had pitched into a simulated engine failure, unable to finish the auto-rotation because her brother had just died doing it for real, and the evaluator who had looked at her failure and seen a disqualification instead of a specific grief in a specific moment.
I thought about 6 years of being a medic.
6 years of performs beyond scope of MOS, 6 years of someone else's math running in the back of her head while she worked, the math of altitude and rotor RPM and descent rate, the math she'd learned at Fort Rucker and never been allowed to use, living alongside the other math, the one she was authorized to run, the one about blood pressure and hemopneumothorax and 30 more seconds.
2 kinds of math. 1 body. 6 years.
She'd brought Diego with her into the cockpit the way you bring the dead with you into the rooms where they would have wanted to be. She had talked to him the way my mother talked to my father in the last year, when he was gone, and she was arranging his things.
Not grief. Something more functional. Are you watching? Are you watching? I'm going to do it right this time. I closed my laptop. I closed my Moleskine.
I sat for another minute in the humming room, and then I picked up my pen and opened the Moleskine again and wrote in the margin at the bottom of the page, not for the record, not for the recommendation, just for the accumulation of what I now understood: she was talking to the person she learned to fly for.
My pen stayed on the paper. The light hummed. Outside, the FOB kept running. I did not sleep the night after the interview. This is not unusual for me.
I have a certain kind of insomnia that is not anxiety, it is closer to digestion. My mind processes things while the rest of me is trying to rest, and sometimes the processing is louder than the resting, and I end up sitting on a cot in the dark listening to a FOB breathe and trying to decide if what I am feeling is insight or rationalization.
They feel remarkably similar from the inside. What I kept returning to was Article 109. Willful destruction, damage, or loss of military property. The word willful. The word that required intent, not just action. The legal standard I had been sent to apply. She had not been reckless. She had been the opposite of reckless, she had been the most precise possible responder to a set of circumstances that left no room for imprecision. She had damaged the aircraft in the same way a surgeon damages tissue to save a life, the minimum necessary harm, inflicted with full understanding of its cost, for the preservation of something more important than the thing being damaged. The aircraft was substantially intact. Webb was alive. Vasquez was in Landstuhl with his lung. Bowen and Kraft were going home. The math. But Article 109 didn't ask about the math. It asked about intent.
And her intent clearly, demonstrably, by her own account, had been to prevent a greater loss of military property, military personnel, and military life by using a piece of military property that she had no authorization to use.
There was an argument.
I could see it, clean and, lawyerly, available.
A narrow reading. A technical one.
The kind of reading that was correct in the letter without being correct in any other sense. I got up at 3 in the morning and sat at the tiny desk in my billet with my laptop open and started drafting the preliminary recommendation.
I wrote 2 paragraphs and stopped.
Outside, the FOB at 3 a.m., generators, a distant sentry calling out a check, a dog somewhere that wasn't supposed to be here and had been here for 2 years regardless. The sky through my small window was dense with stars, the same stars as the night before, the same impossible density, making no concession. I closed the laptop. I needed one more thing that wasn't in any database. I went to the aid station the next morning without my Moleskine. She noticed that first. Her eyes dropped to my left hand, the Moleskine hand, and found it empty, and something in her recalibrated. "This isn't official," I said. "Okay," she said. She was reorganizing the trauma kit bags, the kind of task that looks like busywork but isn't. Each bag had a specific sequence, a specific content, and the sequence mattered in the dark, in the field, when you reached in by feel, and the thing your hand found had to be the right thing. She worked through it with her back to me while I stood near the door. "You found out about Fort Rucker," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "And Diego?" "Yes." She moved a tourniquet from one pouch to another. Moved it back. Decided the first position was correct. "He wanted to fly since he was 5, she said. Still to the kit bag, to the far wall, to the private record she kept. He used to build model helicopters and hang them from his bedroom ceiling. We shared a room until I was 12, and I used to fall asleep watching them turn in the ceiling fan draft." She paused. "He was better than me. At the flying. He was better at the instruments and the procedures and the calm, the thing you need where you just don't panic. He had it naturally.
I had to work for it. You were both in the same program. I was 2 years ahead. I finished primary and started the Apache conversion course. He was still in primary.
She set down a compression bandage, very carefully, on the edge of the table.
He crashed on a Tuesday. I washed out on Sunday. The auto-rotation. The compression bandage.
The evaluator ran a simulated engine failure, she said.
It was a standard test. I'd passed it 3 times in the simulator.
I got into the auto-rotation and she stopped.
I just couldn't. I sat there.
I knew what to do and my hands knew what to do and I sat there anyway and the evaluator failed me and that was she turned around.
She was not crying. I want to be clear about that.
She looked like someone who had been through the specific furnace that burns all the water out of grief and leaves something harder and more permanent behind.
That was the last time I was in a cockpit, she said. Until Cuner. I looked at her.
I looked at the scar at her temple, old, white, a decade gone, and I thought about how it got there and thought about what kind of year deposits that kind of scar on a 22-year-old's face, what kind of accumulated impact, what kind of learning.
October 14th, I said. She looked at the floor. I know. Did you know when it was happening? She frowned. I knew the date. I knew. She looked up.
But, that's not why I know that's not why, I said.
She stopped.
We looked at each other across the aid station, across the kit bags and the antiseptic smell and 6 years of unfinished knowledge, and I think she was waiting for me to say something that would require her to defend herself. Something that would require her to argue that the date was a coincidence, that she hadn't made a performance of it, that what she'd done in that cockpit wasn't a memorial act dressed as a tactical one.
I didn't say any of it. Because it wasn't any of it. What she'd done in that cockpit was what she always did, the math. The minimum necessary action. The 30 seconds.
The hands on the controls without hesitation, without ceremony, because Vasquez and Bowen and Kraft and Webb were in front of her and the math required her to be in the cockpit and that was the entire decision, beginning to end. The date was just the universe being cruel in its particular way, leaving the accounting until exactly long enough that you'd stopped waiting for it, and then presenting the bill.
He would have been good at it, she said. Quiet. Not for me. He would have been remarkable. That's the word.
He would have stopped being the kid with the model helicopters and become the thing the model helicopters were gesturing at.
She looked at her hands. He was 20 years old. I said nothing.
She picked up the compression bandage.
Put it in the correct pouch. What were you saying? I said. In the cockpit. To him. A long time. I think I was saying I'm doing it. Over and over. She didn't look at me. I think I was saying I'm doing it, I'm doing it, I'm doing it. I don't know if that was for him or for me. I don't know if there was a difference. I'm doing it. 6 years of I'm doing it.
6 years of the unfinished thing running alongside the work she was authorized to do, patient, wordless, waiting. 6 years of being present in all the ways the Army had decided she was permitted to be present, carrying in the private inventory of herself the thing they'd decided she didn't get to keep.
I'm doing it. She finally did.
I picked up my Sankofa key from my pocket and held it and thought about my grandmother pressing it into my 12-year-old palm at Kotoka Airport and saying, in Chui, the thing it meant, return and get it.
What you have lost, go back for it.
She had been talking about Ghana, about identity, about the child I was going to become in a country that didn't know me yet. She hadn't been talking about a helicopter over a ravine in Cuner province.
She hadn't had to be. Sergeant Reyes, I said. She looked at me. I'm going to need you to do something for me, I said. Not for the inquiry. Separately from the inquiry. She waited. I need you to go talk to someone from the flight program, I said. A formal interview. On your record. I'm going to write a referral. She looked at me for a long moment. Why? She said. Not suspicious. Genuinely asking. Because there is a provision, I said carefully, for the retroactive documentation of demonstrated aviation competency in exceptional operational circumstances. It has a very specific name and it is very rarely used, and I have never written one before. But it exists. I looked at her steadily. It exists for exactly this kind of gap. She stared at me. That's not, she stopped. Started over. That doesn't exist. It does, I said. It's in the Aviation Branch Regulation, paragraph 2 to 14, subparagraph C. Retroactive skills validation following combat demonstration. I had found it at 2:30 in the morning between my second and third drafts of the preliminary recommendation. I had read it 4 times. It was written in 1985 for a Vietnam-era case that I genuinely cannot imagine, but the language is broad enough to cover this. You'd still need a formal evaluation. You'd still need to go through the process. I paused. But the door is open. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at the helicopter coming down, the way Danner had described. Not like, of course. Not like finally. Like someone who had just remembered something they'd been trying to forget. I looked at the kit bag. Your wrist needs more time before you can grip a cyclic properly anyway, I said. She looked at her wrist. Then, she looked at me with something in her face that was the closest I had seen to unguarded, not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implies that the thing given was someone else's to give. More like recognition. Like acknowledgement of a thing that had been owed for a while. It lasted 3 seconds. Then, she turned back to the kit bag. I'll think about it, she said. I laughed. I wrote the preliminary recommendation over 6 hours that evening. Webb had submitted a revised statement. I had requested it the previous day and it arrived by secure transmission that afternoon, and I read it twice before I incorporated it. In it, he described regaining partial consciousness during the descent, not enough to act, not enough to understand his physical situation, but enough to hear. A voice. A woman's voice, counting, he wrote. Counting, or calling out numbers, I couldn't tell which. I focused on it. I followed it back. She had been reading instruments out loud. Altitude. Rate of descent. Rotor RPM. Calling them out the way a pilot calls out an approach, not for Webb's benefit, he wasn't conscious enough for benefit, but because it was the discipline, the structure, the way you stay inside the procedure when everything else is trying to pull you out of it. He had followed the numbers back to consciousness. She had not known she was doing that for him. I sat with that for a while and, then, I wrote. Article 109 requires willful destruction or damage. The aircraft was not willfully damaged, it was controlled by an unauthorized operator under exigent circumstances with the express purpose of preventing greater damage to the aircraft, its crew, and personnel on the ground. The aircraft sustained damage consistent with an emergency hard landing. The structural integrity was maintained. The crew and medevac personnel survived. I went through the elements carefully. I cited the regulation. I cited Webb's statement, both statements. I cited the witness accounts, each one, with their specific language intact. She finished the procedure. She looked like she'd remembered something she'd been trying to forget. Who the hell is she? I wrote the section on intent. I wrote it twice. The second version was better because it was more honest. I wrote the referral for the aviation review. I attached the specific regulatory paragraph. I wrote 3 sentences explaining its applicability and, then, deleted 2 of them because they were explaining something that didn't need explaining, and the whole document was better for their absence. Then, I wrote the recommendation. I am not going to tell you what it said. It is not mine to reproduce here. It was a legal document in a file that belongs to the Army and, to her and, to the record of a day in October 2011 that I was sent to document but never entirely managed to contain. What I can tell you is that it took me 6 hours to write and 3 minutes to read, and that when I read it back I changed 1 word in the final sentence, and then I did not change anything else because it was true. In every sense I knew how to make a document true,
and I had nothing more to add to it. I submitted it at 2300 hours. Then, I closed my laptop and sat in the dark billet and looked at the ceiling and listened to the FOB at night. My father used to say, there are two kinds of right. The kind that is correct, and the kind that is true. You should always choose the second kind when they are different, and accept that sometimes there is a cost. I held my Sankofa key. Go back for what was lost. She had gone back. Over a ravine in Kyoner province at altitude, with a dead man beside her and a broken wrist and 3 men on the ground and the voice of her 20-year-old brother counting down with her, she had gone back and gotten it. I hoped the army knew what to do with that. My extraction was at 0600. I was at the LZ at 0540, kit packed, Moleskine in my left hand, the cold before Afghan sunrise sitting on everything like a presence. The sky to the east was beginning its slow negotiation with the dark, a line of pale orange not yet bright enough to earn the word dawn, but committed to it. I saw her across the LZ. She was working. Of course she was. Reyes at 0545 was not watching sunrises, she was transferring equipment to an incoming unit's medic, walking him through a kit bag with the patient precision I recognize by now as her specific and non-transferable form of generosity. Her breath was visible in the cold. She pointed at something in the bag, said something, pointed again. The junior medic, 20-something, careful, holding his notepad with the anxiety of someone who understands the details here are not academic, nodded and wrote and nodded again. She didn't see me. I watched her for a moment. I watched her hands move through the kit bag contents, efficient and exact, and I thought about those same hands on a cyclic at altitude with everything going wrong, and I thought about the gap between what we authorize people to be and what they actually are, the gap she'd been living in for 6 years, quietly, without complaint, doing the job she was permitted to do while carrying the job she was not, the way you carry anything you've learned to live with, without broadcasting it. Without asking for anything. Just carrying it, day after day, until the day you need it. She looked up. She saw me. Across 30 meters of LZ gravel, in the thin light before the sun committed to its appearance, she looked at me. I nodded. Not dramatically. Not with any particular weight. I am not someone who makes gestures into ceremonies. I nodded the way you nod at someone when the words are either unnecessary or impossible, when the most honest thing you can offer is the acknowledgement that you saw them. That you looked, and kept looking, and saw what was there. She held my gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face. I have spent 17 years reading faces as legal documents, parsing micro-expressions for what they confirm or deny or refuse to address. What moved across her face was not gratitude, and it was not relief, and it was not the performance of either. It was more specific and harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of someone who has been accurately seen and is deciding how they feel about it. She nodded back. One beat. Clean. Then, she turned back to the kit bag and the young medic and continued exactly where she'd left off. My Black Hawk came in over the ridge to the south, rotors loud in the thin air, the familiar organized violence of a helicopter's arrival filling the LZ with sound and wind. I picked up my kit. I walked toward it. I didn't look back. I got on. The door gunner helped me settle, pointed to the headset, the standard choreography of departure. The rotors above me accelerated. The skids lifted. I held the Sankofa key in my right palm, rosewood, worn smooth, warm from my body heat, and looked through the porthole at the FOB as it diminished below us, the razor wire, the sandbag TOZ, the aid station where the smell of antiseptic and protein bars and urgency had settled permanently into the walls, the LZ where a medic was already back at work, hands in a kit bag, methodical, patient, giving a junior colleague the knowledge he'd need when the next time came. As it would. As it always did. The FOB grew small. The valley opened. The Hindu Kush rose on every side, vast and gray-brown and indifferent, and above it the dawn was finally arriving, orange to gold, gold to pale blue, the sky making its daily argument that light persists, that it always returns, that no darkness in these mountains has ever been permanent. I thought about the 6 words. Sergeant Reyes was present. Webb had written them as protection, as shelter, as the grammatical equivalent of standing between her and whatever came next. What he hadn't known, what none of them had known, was that she didn't need the shelter the way he thought she needed it.
She wasn't fragile. She wasn't hiding.
She was just waiting for the inquiry to catch up to the facts, the way she'd waited for everything else, with the specific patience of a person who has been carrying their own truth for so long that they've stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. She knew what she'd done.
She'd known all along.
I opened my Moleskine and looked at the last page I'd written on. At the bottom, in the margin, in the handwriting of someone who just understood something they hadn't come there to understand, she was talking to the person she learned to fly for.
Below it I wrote one more thing. Not for the record.
Not for the recommendation, which was already submitted, which was already in the file, which would run its course through the machinery of the army and arrive at whatever outcome it arrived at in the months to come.
Just for myself. Just for the accumulation.
She finished the procedure.
The Black Hawk banked south. Afghanistan spread below me, ancient and enormous and entirely uninterested in any of our accounting. I put my pen away. I held the Sankofa key. I did not know what would happen to her next.
I would not find out for some time, and, when I did, it would come in pieces, sideways, through channels that were only partly mine to access: a mention in a report, a name in a roster, a notification in a database I happened to be consulting for an unrelated case, 3 years later, that listed a particular soldier's reclassification and new assignment. I did not know that on the morning of my departure. What I knew was what I had seen. What I had recorded and submitted and would carry, in the way you carry things that have changed the shape of your understanding without your permission, for the rest of whatever career and life I had remaining. A woman in an aid station, hands in a kit bag, explaining the sequence to someone new.
Patient. Precise. Present.
The morning her brother's absence became something she could fly with.